another is Mr. Dhruva Jaishankar. He's a fellow of Foreign Policy Studies at the Brookings India Foundation. And Mr. Jaishankar today will be speaking on Indian foreign policy. And the theme is that have we moved on from a balancing to a global role. So he'll also be covering something about India, China, and the local issue. And this is how it'll go about. So he'll be speaking for around 30-35 minutes, and after that we'll be leaving the floor open for questions.
Having me here. Can you all hear me? Can you hear me in the back? Thank you to NUJS. Thanks to the organizers. It's really nice to be in Calcutta for this lecture. I'm here to talk about India's role in the world. And this might seem like a very broad, fluffy topic, but I have been spending the last year plus going around talking to university campuses, to student groups about this topic. And I think it's a very important issue because in various ways this matters to each and every one of you. All of you are budding law students, budding lawyers, and it will be surprising, and I'll get into this in some detail as to why, but I think it will be surprising if any of you go through the rest of your career without in some way being affected by India's engagements with the world. And so the better we can understand it, why it's important, how it's changing, the better hopefully all of you will be informed. I want this to be a discussion as much. I learn a lot from these discussions as well. So I will just speak for about half an hour, and then I'll sit down here and we can continue the discussion, and I really want to hear from all of you. There's a particular importance and symbolism, I think, of talking about India's role in the world here in Calcutta. A few years ago, how many of you have been to Shanghai? How many of you have been to China, actually? Not okay. Beijing or? Beijing. In Shanghai, Shanghai is quite a thing to see because it really, I think, symbolizes the change that has taken place in China and in Asia in the last 25 years or so. But there is a part of Shanghai, it's called the Bund, and this is the old part of town, the old colonial era structures. A lot of them are banking houses and have now been converted into luxury shopping centers and so forth. They're very beautiful old buildings. And one of those buildings in Shanghai is the HSBC building. Many of you know HSBC, the bank. So it was the old HSBC headquarters. And inside the HSBC headquarters in Shanghai, there's a big mosaic. It's a beautiful dome, like some of the colonial era buildings here. And there's a mosaic, and it has 8 sides, 8 panels. And the 8 panels each represent one of the great financial centers of the world. And this is in the early 20th century. So these were the 8 great financial centers of the early 20th century. So can anybody guess what those 8 cities are? Or what would have been the great financial centers of the world? London, okay, 1.
New York,
okay. 1 more in Europe?
Paris,
okay, so those are 3. Surprisingly, the rest are in Asia. So one is Shanghai, obviously, which is Tokyo. Hong Kong.
Mumbai.
No. Calcutta. The other 2 are, oddly enough, Bangkok and Calcutta. So these are all these happen to be the 8 cities where HSBC Bank had offices at that time. And so it's interesting now to think of in the early 20th century, Calcutta was one of the major financial centers of the world. And it was in some ways a gateway to the rest of India. It was, of course, it was in Bengal that the Bengal Renaissance happened. I think people here may remember it, but I think people in other parts of India don't quite appreciate how much of an impact that had, not just in India, but out globally as well. When Tagore traveled to China and Japan, he was a rock star. He was the first Asian to have won a Nobel Prize. Same thing, just fast forwarding a little bit, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, from here, of course, but who in some ways was very much involved in the politics and in shaping the politics of Asia in the 1930s and 1940s. And with the INA after the fall of Singapore. So in some ways, Calcutta has always been a sort of a gateway to India's engagements with Asia in particular and the world at large by extension. Hopefully we'll see a time when it will come back into that role. Indians have a very mixed feeling about, I've noticed, about their response to India and Indian power, Indian influence in the world. It's a little bit like following the Indian cricket team. When the Indian cricket team wins, when we win the World Cup or something like that, we're like, we're the best in the world, number one, and so forth. Every time we lose a series or something, there's a whole lot of despondency, and suddenly we blame cricketers for being overpaid and over-adulated. And it's a little bit similar when you every time there's been a big success, the Indian nuclear deal, the US-Indian nuclear deal, or India doing something on the world stage, it's seen as a triumphant victory. Every time there's a setback, even a mild one, it suddenly becomes a reason for despondency. And this is reflected in public attitudes. We did a survey a few months ago, we released it in June of this year, of Indian public attitudes towards the world. And interestingly enough, over 50% of respondents, and this is done all over India and in tier 2 towns as well, over 50% of respondents believe that India was already the most powerful country in Asia. So this is true. And an even larger number believe that in 10 years, India would be the most powerful country in Asia. At the same time, however, 50% of the same respondents believe that India should not be involved in the affairs of other countries. So there's this weird dichotomy and contradiction here, and this is reflected in Indian public attitudes. Between, on the one hand, we want to be a great power, we want to be, have our rightful place in the world. On the other hand, if it comes to, well, what should we do about it, then not so sure. So, just taking back, and I like looking at these things from a historical perspective. I studied history as an undergraduate, and in some ways, Indian leadership, when India became independent in 1947, Indian leadership was very natural, particularly again in the broader Asian context. In February or March of 1947, so this is a good 6 months before independence, Pandit Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi organized a conference in Delhi, which was supposed to be a pan-Asian conference. And they actually got people to fly leaders from Indonesia, from Vietnam, there were delegates from Mongolia, from Tibet, from Japan, even from Turkey and Australia. I mean, that was the scope of it. And Pandit Nehru gave a speech actually at that time, which said Asia's time is coming. And it was interesting that India sort of was pushing itself as a newly independent India would be the natural leader in this space. So this was before the communist revolution in China, which was 2 years later. India was just at the cusp of becoming independent, and various countries from Burma onwards were waiting in the wings to follow India at the time. Even after that, India actually played a very active role, and I think again this is sometimes underappreciated. India was the mediator between the US and China in 1950, before the Korean War. The Indian ambassador was actually the go-between between the Chinese, because the US and China communist China did not have diplomatic relations. India played the role of repatriating prisoners of war during the Korean War between North Korea and South Korea. And this was a newly independent India we're talking about here. India was one of the first countries to welcome Japan back into the international community by accepting Japanese foreign assistance in the 1950s. At the 1955, India helped organize the Bandung Conference in what's now Indonesia, again to try and carve out the norms and values of a third way, as they saw it, and what we now think of as non-alignment. That basically was a plea in some ways for Pan-Asian and African unity. This was not without some criticism. Many people have subsequently and even during the time criticized this. But a lot of this came to an end with the 1962 war with China, which shattered some of the illusions about Asian solidarity, that two large Asian countries could not go to war with each other, that they could not resolve their differences diplomatically. It also exposed some of India's own vulnerabilities. Our armed services were not prepared for a variety of reasons that were looked into later. But that kind of led to the beginning of a more inward-looking India. But again, fast forward a little bit, and between 1971 and 1991 or so, we had a different phase where India was still active internationally, but in a much smaller area, which is basically our immediate neighborhood. And this started in some ways with the Bangladesh war, which was an intervention, and what turned out to be a very successful intervention in a neighboring country. and basically culminated with the withdrawal from of Indian troops from Sri Lanka in 1990, which in some ways brought along another set of lessons for India to learn the hard way. But in between, India actually was quite interventionist, not just in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, but in the Maldives in 1987, in Seychelles, in Mauritius, where India actually sent warships to prevent coups or to assure a certain political outcome. And so you have in some ways a rather outward-looking India, except in a much narrow, smaller scope. One of the problems, and this again became apparent by the early 1990s, was that despite all of this, India had paid insufficient attention to the fundamentals of global power, and that was largely its own economic growth and health. After the early 1960s, really after Japan's re-rise after World War II, with perhaps the 1964 Tokyo Olympics is kind of a marker of that. And then, the rise of Singapore, South Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, the four Asian tigers, and then subsequently mainland China. Growth really became the currency of power and influence in the Asia-Pacific region. And India missed the boat on that. This is not to say that the Indian economy was a complete tatters. In fact, you see a distinct improvement after independence in 1947. I still find this staggering, but per capita incomes between 1900 and 1947 in India grew 3%, not 3% per year, 3% total in 47 years. And there was an improvement after independence. So, for a long time when you hear certain historians such as Neil Ferguson and people like that saying that India was better off under British colonial. I think that's nonsense. That's not shown empirically. But that being said, India missed the boat in some ways on this for a number of reasons that have to do, some of it with India, some of it with the global context. India wasn't able to strengthen its economy sufficiently, and so we ended up with a balance of payments crisis in 1991, which forced the economic liberalization, the start of economic liberalization. Another thing also happened in 1991, which was India's closest international partner, the Soviet Union, collapsed. And the context of the Cold War, which was this rivalry between two superpowers, and not just two superpowers, but two ideologies, really came to an end, and one side became separate. So basically, I like to think of 1991 as a starting point for thinking about India today, because the structure of international politics changed overnight. The structure of the Indian economy started to change, not as rapidly, but that's really a starting point. And also the nature of Indian, this took a little bit more time to manifest itself, but the nature of Indian politics also started to change. So we had, again, with the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi, we started a few years later, we had the Babri Masjids, we had the rise of the BJP. But you ended up first in a period of loose coalition governments, but then effectively a two-party system, at least nationally, which began to emerge after the early 1990s. And so in some ways, that is really a starting point for thinking about India today as a power. How have India's relations with the world changed in that time? A few things happened almost immediately after 1991. There was an opening with the US, which had been held back. Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi both tried to forge a better relationship with the US, but were limited by the structure, the context of the Cold War. But that started to change in the 1990s. India established diplomatic relations with Israel. India began its Look East policy, and this was initially motivated by economics, that is seeking an economic model and economic investment from Asia, particularly Southeast Asia and China, South Korea, Japan. A few other developments then, you then had India gradually integrate into the global economy, join the World Trade Organization. It moved, after the 1998 nuclear tests, it moved basically over the next 10 years from an international pariah. After 1998, in fact, the US, China, and Russia tried to work together to impose sanctions on India. By 2008, where India had completely transformed relations with the US, China, and Russia. And the thing is, every government, subsequent government, at least one that survived the full term, contributed in various ways to this. The Rao government in the early mid-1990s, the Vajpayee government, the Manmohan Singh government, and subsequently the Modi government. Post 1998 also, I forgot to mention, economic relations with China took off. So trade went from basically zero, or very little in 2000, to almost 70 billion US dollars only about 10, 12 years later. There was also, again, a renewal in relations with Russia, and an opening up with Japan, which, again, reached a low point with the nuclear tests. Subsequently, again, we've seen developments just in the last 5-6 years, and I'm going to go into these in a bit more detail, which have required a more urgent revisitation of India's relations with its neighbors, including Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. We've also seen the growing securitization of India's Asia-Pacific policies, including with China. We've seen new openings emerge into our west, particularly with the Gulf Arab states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar. And India, on international issues, on global issues, India has gone from being a veto wielder, which is India can prevent a major international agreement, to actually starting very slowly to shape international norms. I'll detail this in a bit. I think it's also important to dwell a little bit on Indian power, because again, as I mentioned, you hear all sorts of things. Why is India thinking about itself as a global power when we have so many problems at home? Which is a very legitimate argument. On the other hand, people say, why isn't India doing enough abroad? It now is able to, it should be doing it, it has its rightful place. And I think part of the problem depends on what type of power you're talking about. In some respects, India already is a global power. It has the world's largest diaspora of any country. It's one of the world's largest energy importers of any country. India shapes defense markets. One contract that India makes changes the entire global arms market. In other areas, India is a veto wielder, as I mentioned earlier, on trade issues, arguably. Global trade will stall and has stalled because India has certain objections to it. I say cybersecurity is another issue, which is if there are to be global norms in cybersecurity, if India is not a participant in that, it would not go forward. Climate change represents another issue, although that has changed even more in the last year or so. In other respects, India has a niche power. On space, for example, India punches well above its weight given how much it invests in its space program. On IT services, again, this is something that's a source of pride for many Indians. In yet other respects, India is still a regional power, and militarily, arguably, it still is. Its ability to project power is really only in its immediate neighborhood, in the Indian Ocean, but it's starting to be able to project a little bit of power in the Western Pacific, but it's still in very early stages. That being said, this is one area where India has weight. Despite having very low per capita incomes and per capita spending on issues, when it comes to there are few countries in the world, for example, that have a blue water navy, which is a navy with large ships that is able to travel very far. So many Southeast Asian countries, for example, look to India to play a role because they individually, by themselves, cannot play that role. Finally, on many other respects, India is still very much behind the curve, and that's almost on almost every issue on a per capita basis. So while the aggregate power that India has is considerable, and in a few areas that I outlined, it's able to project that power. On any issue, if you take on a per capita basis, India still does rather poorly. Health, on education, which those two things then affect human resources. And even law and order, and I think we just saw that even yesterday. I just came from Delhi, where people are a bit perturbed by a rapist godman, private army running amok. But that you would think that should not be happening in a country that sees itself as a global power. And again, in many other respects, while India does reasonably well, it still punches a little bit below its weight. And you can see this, for example, in agriculture, where India is a major exporter of certain commodities, but still could be doing a lot better and is doing it in an efficient manner. And even manufacturing and integration into global supply chains. It's also important, not just to think about Indian resources and Indian power, but also the challenges that India faces. Again, I harken back to 1991 because I think we've come a long way in terms of dealing with our existential challenges. We perhaps underestimate the degree to which the very existence of India as a unified, prosperous, and democratic society entity was really under threat for much of the first 35, 40 years of independent India's existence. So in 1991, just to take that, not only do we have a balance of payments crisis, not only was India's closest defense partner suddenly imploding, but we had insurgencies flaring up in Kashmir. We still had the Punjab insurgency taking place. We just pulled out of Sri Lanka with a humiliating retreat after intervening there 3 years previously. We were facing in some ways a China and a Pakistan that not only contested Indian territory, but both actually by 1991 were in possession of nuclear weapons. And so India was actually quite vulnerable at this point. And since then, there's still plenty of problems, but India's done it dealt with most of its insurgencies, some better than others, even if it's not entirely extinguished some of the sentiments. Terrorism actually peaked in 2002, if you look at it in terms of violent incidents. There's been a pretty sharp decline after 2006. There's still incidents, and it's still a source of concern, but it's not nearly as pervasive as it was about 15 years ago. The Indian economy is more diversified. It's stronger. Our current account balance is healthier. Our currency, foreign exchange reserves are higher. And we have a nuclear deterrent, which, while it won't solve minor security issues such as terrorism, it doesn't defend India from those kinds of things. It is, it basically prevents prospect of major conflict with other powers. So, India's objectives, therefore, going forward and having overcome some of these existential challenges, is really to have a strong and secure India, a prosperous India, and a democratic India. Again, some may argue that those objectives require India to prioritize the looking words, to prioritize developments at home. And this is short-sighted and unwise, and I'll explain why in a second. Let me give you 3 quick examples of how and why the world engagement with the world matters. One is a smartphone, right? So what goes into a smartphone? What are the components of a smartphone? And just not technical. Processors. What else?
The metal.
The
metal.
The body.
Metals, plastics, materials.
The touch screen.
Touch screen, so liquid crystal display, right?
Sensors,
right? So all of those things, right? So where do they come from? Liquid crystal display. Most of it comes from South Korea. The microchips, the processors, most of them, and this doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether it's an iPhone or a Samsung or the brand doesn't matter. The processors come from China, right? Many of them do. Some of those things are even made in India. But it requires a few things, and some of the not just physical things again. It requires research and development and technology. It requires intellectual property patents. It requires economies of scale to keep costs down. It requires an open trading system. And it requires things like freedom of navigation to ensure that those supplies all come to one place where this is manufactured and then comes to So, something that we take for granted is such an essential part of a lot of our lives is really dependent on these very soft issues related to the international order. If we had a breakdown in freedom of navigation, if we had a breakdown in the trading system, then something like this will, at the very least, the costs will go up, which will make it prohibitively expensive for many of us. I'll give you a second example. The metro rail. I know Calcutta has the oldest one in the country, but in some ways we now have 14 metro systems in India that are either have been built or are under construction. And this really started, I think, in some ways with the Delhi metro, which sort of became the blueprint for others to follow. And that required capital, it required technology, but it also required know-how, right? How to operate it, what are maintenance protocols, things like that, to ensure that it was run safely. And India could have done all of that on its own. It would have taken us 30 years to put together a modern metro system. But with the help, and it was not just financial assistance, but technical assistance, technological assistance and technical assistance that India received from Japan, South Korea, and others, India was able to do that in about 10 years. So again, and now that's become an integral part in some ways of the transportation ecosystem of most major metro areas. A third example, public health. So average incomes in India are roughly the same as the US in the late 19th century. The term late 19th, early 20th, maybe now early 20th century. Life expectancies are on average the same as the US in the 1960s. So even on an income level, we are, and then if you look at it on a health level, we're 60 years ahead of the curve that the US, the development curve that the US went through. And so what that suggests is it's not simply about money. There's not simply a correlation between money and public health, but there's also knowledge. And that knowledge comes because of the breakthroughs in science and technology and R&D, in the application of that technology. So the very fact that we're able to eradicate polio, and deal with a lot of other diseases, has contributed to higher life expectancy. So I mean, these are I give these examples: the smartphone, metro rail, life expectancy, public health, as ways. I mean, these are things that touch all of our lives on a day-to-day basis, but they're very much dependent on how India engages with the world. Is it able to source technology, not just technology, but also know-how, best practices? Is it able to get capital? And is it able to do it in a manner that is cheap and fast and so forth? And so this leads to a whole bunch of issues, again, which I mentioned are somewhat fluffy and we take for granted, which don't seem to have a very direct impact on our day-to-day lives, but actually do. So issues like how can we make data security? Can we preserve an open trading system? Can we do all of this in an environmentally sustainable manner that isn't just one country doing it, but is actually other countries following similar principles? How can we maximize financial flows? Can we get access to global markets? So all of these are issues, I think, again, very concrete ways in which India's engagements with the world and this very fluffy idea of the international order does play a role. Two more things just before we end. I want to just give a brief overview of how India is engaging with the region, and not the region, but also the world today. And finally, just a few lessons that I think might be important or useful. I've said, a lot of people say, well, what is India's grand strategy? What is, is there a method behind? You see a lot of news reports that Prime Minister Modi, or this is equally applicable to the previous Prime Minister, is going around the world and all these summits and is meeting people and is there a method behind all of that madness? Why do countries engage in this kind of diplomacy? And I would say there's actually a very clear method behind all of this, and there are very clear objectives as well. And there are at least 5, and I try to highlight these. One, and linked to the previous point I was making, is really ways to accelerate India's own development. And I think that this will always be priority number 1. So this is about sourcing investment, it's sourcing technology, it's sourcing know-how from the developed world and other advanced industrialized economies, including China and Russia. So you see, for example, when the Indian Prime Minister goes somewhere, they meet not just with the leaders, but they meet with business groups in a bid to get them to invest in India. They'll meet with universities to ensure that there are knowledge partnerships that try to come out of this. So there are a whole bunch of ways in which that can be done. And this again has applications in the defense sector for India, in terms of energy, in terms of health, in terms of education, a whole bunch of other areas. The second objective that India has is to ensure a stable periphery. And I think I don't need to stress this point too much, I think, here, because what happens today in Nepal has very direct implications for the neighboring states, for UP, for Bihar. What happens in Bangladesh has implications here in West Bengal. What happens in Sri Lanka has implications for Tamil Nadu. And this is by virtue not just of geographical proximity, but the fact that, say, with Nepal we have an open border. We do have a flow of people, we have a flow of financing, we have the potential flow for trade. We have to deal with the illicit flows as well, whether goods or people. And this is politically sensitive as well. So any political leader in Delhi should be paying attention to these issues. India is having to address this in a few ways. One is through diplomatic attention. So we've just had the Nepali Prime Minister visit. We will have visits to Myanmar, to Bangladesh. The foreign minister will be in Sri Lanka next week. And one is just to get our neighbors to understand that their future is intertwined with India's. And so their concerns are India's concerns and vice versa. The second way of dealing with the neighbors is really to improve connectivity. And this has become, I think, the catchphrase of the last couple of years. What do we mean by connectivity? We mean ways to facilitate the flow of goods, capital, people, energy, and those four things: goods, capital, people, and energy. And there have been some important improvements. The land boundary agreement of Bangladesh was important. We need to, if we are to connect with our neighbor Bangladesh, we need to know where India ends and Bangladesh starts. And we need to have a mutually acceptable way of dealing with that. Connectivity is in some ways the counter. Physical infrastructure is one element of it, but there's also agreements, motor vehicle agreements, for example, customs agreements, which are equally important. The establishment of transmission lines across to connect the grids is another way to ensure energy connectivity. A third element of India's neighborhood policy is being a provider of assistance. So part of this is an aid in terms of grants. It's a small but important component of this. The largest recipients are Bhutan, Afghanistan, but the smaller amounts go to Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. But equally, it's about being, when there's a humanitarian disaster, India has been trying to make better efforts to be the first responder. So when there's a water crisis in the Maldives, it's India that's helping out. When there are landslides in Sri Lanka, it's Indian Navy vessels that are now going the first there to help. When there's a cyclone in Bangladesh, when there's an earthquake in Nepal. So that's been another important element. And finally, there's an effort underway to try to inject a new sort of regional institutionalism. In the 1980s, at that time, India became a part of SAARC, which many of you know, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. And the problems with SAARC is it basically works on a consensus basis, so all member countries have to agree to something for it to go forward. And what was happening was that India and Pakistan particularly could not agree on a lot of things. And so the organization itself wasn't able to do a lot of what it was meant to do. And so for that reason, India is trying to look at other alternatives while continuing to invest in SAARC, alternatives. And some of them are more informal. You may have heard of the BBIN, which is Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal, which is kind of an informal grouping of countries to deal with some issues, including the motor vehicle agreement and energy connectivity. The other one is BeamStec, which is an older organization, which is then I'm trying to find out how they can use this more effectively. This is Bhutan, Nepal, Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Thailand. So it connects South Asia to Southeast Asia. So this is what's happening, I think, on the neighborhood front, and it remains to be seen whether this will actually be effective. But there has been very significant movement there. The third objective is ensuring that the Asia-Pacific remains an open and balanced order. And this has really been, the concerns about this have really increased in the last few years with the sudden rise of China. And it's not just the rise of China, there's no objection to that. It's also the manner of that rise. And the manner of the rise is you still have a single-party state that has an opaque governance structure. So when the Chinese make a decision, we don't often know why, whereas if the UK or the US or even to some extent Russia makes a decision, we can kind of figure out why they've done it. Two, there's a feeling that their economic policies have not been fair. While they have benefited significantly from an open trade and economic environment, they have not necessarily been as open. And this plays out with India, for example, which is Indian firms are increasingly frustrated by not being able to access the Chinese market, even in areas where India has a comparative advantage, such as in IT. And other concerns with China just relate to the fact that they have disputes with countries, not just India is one of them, also in the South China Sea, also with Japan and Taiwan, of course, with Bhutan, which is what's been in the news recently. And that other countries have disputes, of course, as well, but China has often tried to deal with these disputes by changing the facts on the ground while negotiating. So even while negotiating on the South China Sea, they basically militarized it. So it was island building in the South China Sea, and they brought in air defenses. So now it makes it difficult for other countries to fly over that space. So we're seeing something similar happening in Bhutan and sometimes with India as well. There were incidents in 2014 and 2015 with India. But what we saw this year was basically an effort to change the facts on the ground with respect to a China-Bhutan dispute, and India intervening there to prevent that from happening, and that didn't stand off. I'm happy to discuss the details of the Pakistan standoff later, but I wanted to contextualize it. So for these reasons, unfair trade unequal trade practices, the sort of opaque system, disrespect for certain international rules and norms, including freedom of navigation and non-proliferation, and trying to change the facts on the ground in these disputes. There are these concerns about China, and India has them, but other countries share those concerns. Basically, most countries around China's periphery. And the fact that China is now more powerful has only accelerated those concerns. So I think, again, just to emphasize, the rise of China in and of itself is not a problem. It's actually a good thing. They've pulled many people out of poverty. It's very admirable in many ways what they've done. But the manner of that rise is really still a point of concern. And so, again, how is India addressing this? I think in three broad ways. One is deepening its economic integration to be another pole, be another economic and commercial pole in this region. So particularly with Southeast Asia, efforts are underway to try and connect the two. Many countries in Southeast Asia feel they are over-dependent on China, for their economic and trade relations are over-dependent on China, and they would like to see another pole, i.e. India, emerge. So that's been one major effort, and this really involves integrating the northeast of India as part of this. I like to point out to people that one state, Assam, has a population the size of Malaysia and has a GDP that's larger than Cambodia and Laos combined. And so if you were to think of India's northeast as part of the Southeast Asian context, it's a significant player. The second element is, and this is mostly done, but India integrating institutionally. In the early 1990s, there was no guarantee that India was considered part of Asia. Asians did not consider India part of Asia. Today, India is now quite reasonably well integrated into the East Asia Summit, various other ASEAN-led institutions, but also various China-led institutions such as the AIIB, Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and so forth. And finally, India is also trying to balance in terms of security, and this has meant developing better defense partnerships with the US, Japan, and Australia that facilitate the exchange of information, that make the two militaries more interoperable, which is in various contingencies they can work together more easily, and building Indian capacity. And in addition, India is also helping various Southeast Asian militaries develop their own capacities, whether it's providing technical assistance to Myanmar, it's providing training for Indonesian officers, Indonesian and Vietnamese officers. India actually provides land, including I think in West Bengal, to the Singaporean armed forces to do training, military training. So in various ways, India is also playing a role as a provider. Just shifting the focus west a little bit, I think one very sensitive issue for India is Pakistan, obviously, and this is a very vexing issue and a very politically sensitive one in India. It's one issue on which Indian voters do tend to pay significant attention to. And the problem here is we have a state, Pakistan, that has as a policy of supporting terrorist groups against India. Now people say it's not the whole Pakistani state and so forth, which is true, but there are certainly elements of the Pakistani state that do provide various kinds of support to terrorists that are targeting India. And not only are they doing that, but they're also doing it with possessing nuclear weapons. And that creates another difficulty because it prevents India from being able to respond in various ways that might otherwise be possible. You also have a Pakistani leadership that is intent on not normalizing relations with India. So just to give you two examples, you all probably know what most favored nation status is, which is it's basically a relationship. It's a normal trading relationship now that the two countries have. India recognizes most favored nation status for Pakistan. It has for many years. Pakistan does not reciprocate. Similarly, Afghanistan was very keen on having a trade agreement that would facilitate Afghan exports to India, which is a very large market, that would go through Pakistan. And Pakistan basically agreed to this if India was kept out of the picture. So these are very, very small things, but they're very noble things for two neighboring countries to do. But it's very difficult to engage with a country that doesn't really want to engage with you. So there's no easy formula for how to deal with Pakistan. I don't think there are any easy solutions. Nobody has come up with one. And it's not unique. I mean, countries are having similar issues with North Korea, which is another nuclear-armed country that doesn't want to engage with the rest of the world. And the US and South Korea, Japan, and China haven't had much luck with dealing with North Korea. Now, Pakistan is not exactly North Korea, but it's a very similar dynamic that India is confronting. And this challenge of compelling Pakistan to abandon terrorism as a state policy is really going to be a challenge for the foreseeable future. In Afghanistan, it is part of the neighborhood. There is a deep concern about the re-Talibanization of Afghanistan, which has very direct implications for Indian security. You are probably all too young to remember this, but in 1999, an Indian Airlines plane flying from Kathmandu to Delhi was hijacked, and it was taken to Kandahar, and at that time controlled by the Taliban. And it required actually the then Foreign Minister Jaswant Singh to go personally to Kandahar to negotiate the release of those hostages. Amongst the people who were released by India in return for the safe passage of those hostages were a certain Masood Azhar, who you've seen in the news now, who is the head of Jaish-e-Mohammed. Also the person who killed, beheaded Daniel Pearl, who was a Wall Street Journal journalist in Karachi. Yes. So, I mean, that just goes to show. I mean, you know, it was 18 years ago now, but there were very direct security implications for India in terms of having Taliban control territory so close to it. And so, preventing the re-Talibanization of Afghanistan is another very important objective, and that means supporting Afghan state building. And India has made major contributions to that by providing aid. It is the fifth largest aid provider. By supporting electricity grid, by building highways, by building the parliament, by training Afghan civil servants, military officers, students. So that remains another important objective. Also West Asia, more broadly, where India again has important interests that include the diaspora. We have a very large diaspora, particularly in the Gulf Arab states. The energy interests. We have this major economy that is the second most dependent after Japan on energy imports from West Asia, and security, of course, including counterterrorism. And this requires, these diverse interests require India to maintain a very tricky balancing act in its relationships in the region, between Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, Iran, Israel, Turkey, Egypt, not all of whom always see eye to eye with each other. And so this has involved sort of deepening those relationships, but on multiple and parallel tracks. It's also meant paying attention to the diaspora there and their safety and security. India has organized evacuations from Yemen, from Lebanon, from Libya, just in the last 10 years or so. And also Iran, of course, remains important, even though less important economically now, as a conduit to Afghanistan. So again, maintaining all of those relationships. Finally, there are questions about the international order and India's role, and how this is. Sometimes we think of this in terms of institutions, institutional membership, but basically this is how to govern anarchic spaces that are outside the realm of states, or fall between the cracks when it comes to state sovereignty. How do we establish the rules for the world? It's important to mention that while we talk about this often in terms of institutions and agreements, that those are not the goals. Those are the means to an end. But just to give you some examples, India is part of various US-led organizations or US organizations that the US started, the World Trade Organization, the IMF, various non-proliferation export control regimes. Equally, India has joined various China-led organizations, BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the IIB. It's joined ASEAN-led organizations, the East Asia Summit, the Asian Defense Ministers meeting, the ASEAN Regional Forum. It has its own that it has initiated, SARC, of course, I mentioned earlier, but also the Indian Ocean Regional Organization, IORA, BIMSTEC, as I mentioned earlier. And some of these are issue-specific. India is a party to UNCLOS, which is the bedrock of the law of the sea. It has joined the Paris Climate Agreement and has agreed to remain in it despite the US withdrawing from that. And on other future agreements on cyberspace, the code of conduct for cyberspace and for outer space, India is actually sort of very much party to those negotiations going forward. Some of these are also regional. There's been a reinvigoration in some ways of India-Africa engagement. We had 40 heads of state and government here for the India-Africa Summit. India hosted the meeting of the Africa Development Bank in Gujarat just recently, a couple of months ago. Same with the South Pacific. India has now with 14 countries in the South Pacific, India has a regular summit. And also India-ASEAN, and we'll see that in January when the leaders of the 10 ASEAN countries come to New Delhi for the Republic Day celebrations. So the purpose behind India doing all of this multilateral diplomacy, this institutional cooperation, again, is we are in a period of an evolving international order, shaped largely by the rise of China, by, in some ways, the relative decline of Japan and Europe, by the US remaining a major power. And in some ways, India missed the boat twice. We missed the boat in 1945 when the rules of the post-war order were being created, and India was not yet independent. We missed just by a little bit. We missed the boat again in 1991, when the post-Cold War world was being reordered a little bit, and because of the nature of that transition, it was not completely reordered, which was part of the problem. But India wasn't in a position then to shape the order that came after that, which is why India was often on the other end of it, of things, whether it was on non-proliferation, whether it was on trade. So I think part of the objective here by India joining these various institutional mechanisms is that whatever world we move into in the future, India is well placed to help set the rules of the road. So it's not simply about matters of prestige. It's about more than that. Finally, a few lessons, takeaways, I think, from this what has been a very broad overview. One is, I think, that leadership matters. We take this a little bit for granted. We think all of this was inevitable in hindsight. This transition from 1947, I would say, and certainly after 1991. But leadership matters, and a lot of these efforts require political will and focus and energy. They require a clear worldview. We need to know what it is we're striving for, and sometimes we tend to confuse ourselves. And we need to appreciate that there's that link between the domestic and the foreign. That there's a political value in a foreign engagement, and it's not simply about going out and flying the flag and so forth. The second thing is about, we need to be cognizant about how we set goals. So on the one hand, you have to be ambitious. If you're not pushing the boundaries, then you're going to stay stagnant in one place. But equally, you have to be conscious of your limitations, and that requires basically a certain realism as well. I sometimes get questions from people saying, why doesn't India do X or Y? And I said, in an ideal world it would, but you have to be conscious of serious resource constraints that the Indian state still has. And finally, I think history matters. We, I think, underestimate our own capabilities. We underestimate to some degree how much India did matter to the world, and this is where I started off this talk. And I think we can do that without resorting to fictions. There's a certain, sometimes we've been seeing a little bit of revisionist history on certain things, that India invented this and that. And I think even with, you don't have to go into the realm of fiction without finding some real sources of true Indian greatness. So I hope you found this interesting. I hope this was wide-ranging enough, and it sort of tried to tie some of these very these issues of high politics that seem very fluffy sometimes to real-world implications and how it matters for each and every one of you as budding lawyers. But I'm happy to address any of these questions in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
So now I'd like to open the floor for questions. So.
Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. So let's do 1, 2.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I had a question.
Where are you from?
As in my
Place.
I'm from Chhattisgarh.
Ah.
Okay. So I had a question that does the closed room policy making and the real world applications or the real world implementation of those policies has a gap, and or does it have some implications on what as in the policy makers thought when they were making their policies?
Could you clarify a little bit? I mean, I'm just trying to understand your question.
Yeah,
So the decisions that are made.
The decisions which are being made in a closed room, are they being realized? Are they being implemented in the real world? As in the climate change that the Barack Obama government agreed and Trump government denied on.
Yeah. So sometimes, the short answer is sometimes that happens, right? So I mean, I think you have to look at what kind of decision it is. Some decisions are basically just setting broad principles. Sometimes it actually, then the translation often has to be into law. So I mean, there are two kinds of translation of policy. One is by law, which is actually something that will involve a lot of you, which is sometimes an international agreement requires India to harmonize its laws with international standards, which requires passing legislation in the parliament. Again, some of this is done on a state level or local level, but sometimes it requires the central level. So that's one element, and you know, there's often a process between certain issues. So I would say laws are one, standards are another, which are not always some that's not always one. So certain standards for in theory education, higher education accreditation, for example. There are certain sort of global practices, and once India signs on to that certain agreement, the expectation is that India will set guidelines domestically that will follow. The third are things which are harder, which are simply policies that are executive policies, and those are at the discretion of ultimately the Prime Minister, but his cabinet and the ministries. So some of that can happen. So let me give you one example on climate change, because you asked about that. India is actually undergoing perhaps one of the most ambitious renewable pushes towards renewable energy ever in history. Meaning we have, I think it is, the number of gigawatt that are coming online. I mean, so the ambition is by 2022, which is 5 years from now. India would have, I think it is 70 of 70 gigawatts of solar, 50 of wind, and 10 of nuclear or something like that. It's 70 and 50, I know, are the solar. This is much more than the entire installed capacity of Germany combined, which is a leader in this. Right? So it's hugely ambitious. Chances are India will not actually make the deadline by 2022, but say it happens by 2025, a few years after that. India is doing this for a few reasons. I mean, there's now, one, the costs have come down significantly, so it's purely economic logic. Two is it's more secure. I mean, so you're less dependent on oil and gas, which has to be imported mostly, and coal. Some of it is for pure ideologically environmental reasons, but it helps having an international agreement against which to peg this. And it's quite possible that India will surpass its own commitments to the Paris Climate Accord. Actually, most likely it will surpass that. But in the absence of, so what I'm saying is India may still have done this even in the absence of the Paris Climate Agreement, but that creates a baseline internationally for other countries to it's a minimum standard basically that countries have voluntarily agreed to. The Paris Climate Change agreement is interesting. It's somewhat different because everybody has different standards that they have voluntarily committed to. But that's not true for certain other issues where, say, trade, where if you're a WTO member, there are certain trade standards that every WTO member has to practice regardless. That's a minimum requirement for membership. And that has collectively brought down tariffs globally. So some of these things do happen. There are various other agreements that get bogged down that don't materialize, or become lower priorities. So, for example, you see for the Chabahar Port Agreement. Right? This is something that was agreed to many years ago. It ran into problems for many reasons, but one of them was that Iran underwent international sanctions. And India, because the UN supported it, India participated in those sanctions and therefore had to take a break on this project. Since Iran has come back from under sanctions, India has revitalized the project, but it's now facing other issues which often have to do with the Iranian side of it. So there are certain, I will grant you that there's on some issues certainly implementation challenges.
So how do we, as in a convention is happening on an international basis, so what should be what as a normal person take a perspective look at it? Okay, so when the convention is completed, those things that are being decided, how should I look at it? Like,
I think this is where actually the media can play a good role of trying to simplify and basically create what are the main points, what are the main implications of a certain international agreement for a domestic audience. I think in some issues they've done a better job than others, but I think sort of translating sometimes the legalese, the international treaty language into layperson's terms is something that the media could do a better job of interpreting. And maybe there's more of a role. I know in the US there's a whole range of legal blogs that do precisely that. They're run by lawyers, and all they do is they basically a judgment comes and they explain what are the implications of that judgment and what in language that somebody like me, who's not a lawyer, can understand. To be fair, we've seen just the last two major Supreme Court rulings, so the right to privacy and I think actually people did a pretty good job of explaining what that. Triple talaq was easier, but what right to privacy meant for average people. So maybe there is a role for all of you to try and communicate some of the legal language. I'll come back to you, but there was a question back here.
So we've seen how complex the Indo-China relations have become in the recent past, be it the standoff at Doklam Plateau, or the Belt and Road Summit that happened in Beijing, and the proposal to have the Maritime Silk Route, which could be, in most circles is being interpreted as a possible encircling of India's influence in the Indian Ocean region by having ports, the Hambantota Port, Gwadar, and Mongla Port in Bangladesh. So, despite the obvious disparities between India and China economically and in terms of hard military strategy, would it not be viable? Can India also go for a tit for tat measure, do something similar to China on its frontiers on the maritime borders, and have a wider group, a multilateral grouping with like-minded countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia, US to counteract the rising influence of China in the Asia Pacific?
Yeah. So, very good question and very timely. So, look, I think we need to. There are four. Traditionally, there have been four elements to the India-China relationship. Broadly speaking, I would say until very recently, two of those areas were largely competitive and two were largely cooperative, which was why we had a relationship. One is bilateral security, which is basically about the border dispute. So we have a large border dispute with China, and have for many years. That involves JNK, involves Uttarakhand, involves Sikkim, it involves Arunachal Pradesh. So four states are directly implicated. So ensuring that that is obviously a point of contention. There have been ways to manage that, and so there were agreements that were entered into in the early 1990s and subsequently into the early 2000s for both sides to peacefully manage the border. So while we do have a long-term dispute, nobody has actually been killed on the border for 40 years. We'll see. There's been. I'll get back to the changes recently. The second area of cooperation was on the multilateral front. So India and China both broadly believed that the international system was unequal and biased against India and China and other rising powers, and therefore cooperated on BRICS as a coalition to achieve what they saw as their rightful place, or a bigger share of governance issues. And also because they were not able to get bigger shares in the IMF, they established they've established their own bank, they've established their own lending mechanisms. That being said, there were always two other areas. There's a third, one more area of cooperation was bilateral economic, which was really trade. So again, we saw trade take off from 0 to 70 billion in a very short amount of time. There was some mutual both sides saw opportunity in each other. And then the other area that has always been a concern is regional security issues. So, there were always concerns about the China-Pakistan relationship and the sharing by China of nuclear technology with Pakistan, which dates back to the late 70s, but really took off in the 80s and 90s, really happened. Nuclear weapons technology, and there's been missile proliferation as well. And then a number of other steps, so including in Nepal and others, where China did certain things that India was uncomfortable with. What we've seen happen in the last, I would say, certainly in the last 3 years, but even before that a little bit, is two of those areas which were positive have become more negative. So increasingly you see China saying, we want a place at the high table, but we don't want a place for India. So they're blocking, for example, Indian membership of the nuclear suppliers group. They're the only P5 country that has not said that India should be a permanent member of the UN Security Council. So when they talk about the global order, they don't see a place for India. So that has changed. There was all this talk about BRICS partnerships and so forth. That's no longer, we're seeing less of that. The other area is the economic relationship is really not going very well because there's growing frustrations on the Indian side, including Indian business, that China is not being becoming an open market. So, whereas the other two have become more severe. So the regional security matters have only become more of a concern. Sri Lanka, I think, is the most obvious case, but I think the Maldives, Nepal less so. I think Nepal is a bit more exaggerated than some, but Bangladesh, I think, is less of a concern, but monitoring. But even farther afield, Seychelles, East Africa, and then Southeast Asia as well. And then, so basically, in all four areas of both what used to be both positive and negative, we've seen a deterioration in relations. I would attribute this largely to the way China is now projecting itself in the world. And this is a much more assertive China, much more confident China that we're dealing with. And so it's not necessarily India specific. It's not because they necessarily dislike India. It's the way they've been dealing with other countries as well. So what is India doing about Belt and Road? And I think India has concerns on two elements of Belt and Road, by the way. One is the maritime Silk Road, and one is this China-Pakistan economic corridor. And the concerns are basically that this is these are investments that are leading to debt traps. We actually just yesterday we hosted the former president of Maldives in my institute, and he spoke very candidly about this. That these are loans that may not ever be paid back, and that economic influence will be translated to political influence, which will then possibly become military influence. So far, the militarization has not yet happened, with some exceptions. Djibouti is one, where China now overtly has a military facility. Gwadar, there is an expectation that it will soon be a military facility because it has been cordoned off. Sri Lanka, there were efforts, but there's been a backlash to that. So it's not yet happened, but there are concerns that may happen in the future. So what is India doing about this? One, I think we saw India set out in May of this year a set of principles for infrastructure investment. It remains to be seen now whether those principles are translated into actual policies and so forth. But those principles were basically fivefold, which is there needs to be transparent cost assessments, the financing needs to be sustainable, it needs to be accompanied by the transfer of knowledge and technology that support local communities, it needs to take into account environmental and ecological considerations, and it needs to respect sovereignty and territorial integrity. So those are the five principles that India laid out. And the assumption is basically China does not follow that. India is making efforts to do some of this on its own in the region. So I think we tend to underplay a little bit India's actual connectivity projects with respect to Nepal, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, to some extent Myanmar and Afghanistan as well. India is doing quite a lot in these countries, and I think it doesn't get a lot of play in the Indian media for various reasons. The second is India is actually working with other countries. Just yesterday there was a relaunch of India and Japan have put together what they call the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, AAGC, which is, it's more focused on soft infrastructure, but a little bit of hard infrastructure, but the idea is to put some of these principles in practice. So we will see this rolled out future. But Japan has been particularly effective. Singapore a little bit. For a variety of reasons, the US is not in a position to play this role because it's mostly private financing as opposed to state-backed financing. At the same time, India is also working with security partners. So, the countries around China's periphery, meaning Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, are much more developed than India. So India is not going to be doing port development in these countries, really. Mongolia, by the way, is a small but significant recipient of Indian aid, but it's a small amount. But so I don't think that is really the way to respond. One is to respond more positively in the near abroad, in the Indian Ocean region and the smaller neighbors in India's neighborhood, from Afghanistan to Myanmar. The second is to deepen security partnerships with the likes of US, Japan, Australia, who share the concerns, basically to ensure that if there is further militarization, that can be addressed or prevented. And that's really the objective. The objective is not to get into a confrontation with China, but to prevent the militarization of. So does that answer your question?
Kind of. I remember I had read about in 2008, India, US, Japan, and Australia had launched a quadrilateral security initiative, which then got aborted because China was.
Yeah, so that happened in 2007. There were quadrilateral exercises. Since then, we've actually seen India now does regular trilateral US, Japan, Australia, and India exercises. Malabar exercises. India also does 2 trilateral dialogues at very senior levels. One is US, Japan, India. One is Japan, Australia, India. So in some ways, I think if this occasionally talk about what if there was to be another quadrilateral dialogue. I think we need to have a more serious conversation first as to what exactly that would accomplish. Because apart from just sending a signal to Beijing, there's what will it do which the current mechanisms don't do already. There's already a great deal of coordination. There are already enough dialogues between these 4 parties in different, because the US, Japan, Australia already have a trilateral. India, Japan, Australia do, and the US, Japan, India do. So what more will be accomplished by this? What are discrete things they can work on? I mean, India has bilateral naval exercise now with all 3. There'll be a big India-Australia exercise in early 2018 off Western Australia. I think that there's a possibility that will come around, but I think some further thought needs to be given as to what exactly that will accomplish. So there are 2 questions here, so let's do it.
So I had 2 questions.
So can you also introduce yourself and where you're from?
Right, so my name is Ananya Kumar. I'm from third year. I'm from Delhi. I had 2 questions. One was that for a very long time, the criticism of Indian foreign policy, at least from the Western powers, has been that India seeks a larger role in the global affairs, yet does not take a hard enough stance on a lot of issues. A very pertinent example being the Myanmar one, where we haven't possibly taken a strong enough stance on the exodus of the Rohingyas that's happening, etc. And Barack Obama would have you believe that for India to become a global power, we have to take stance at least on these regional issues. So, firstly, do you believe that's a fair criticism of Indian policy, and do you believe that we should solidify our stances on things like human rights violations, etc.? And secondly, Indians often criticize countries like China or United States of transgressing into other countries' sovereignty and trying to install puppet governments, etc. Right? Except we did sort of the same thing with Nepal. So, do you believe?
You mean when?
When we blockaded the border just after the earthquake.
Okay, all right. Yeah.
So, and we also often try to infringe upon the sovereignty of Nepal. Some countries like Bhutan are more amenable to it, others aren't. So, do you believe it's a fair criticism of Indian policy to say that we have been slightly hypocritical in the sense that while trying to say that the so-called greater powers are infringing upon sovereignty while doing the same thing themselves?
Sure. One thing, I mean, those are 2 very good questions and interrelated, obviously. One is, I think countries tend to be more principled when they have fewer interests at stake, right? So India can talk about human rights in Latin America or something like that, where there's no cost to doing that, right? But it's not just India. I mean, all countries, a lot of European countries talk about human rights abuse in places where they have zero interest, right? When it's a bit closer to home and the direct security interests or something at play, they tend to be a bit more moderate. So, I mean, you can see this, for example, in terms of how muted the US is sometimes on Pakistan, right? Where they have various interests in Pakistan, which is as a conduit to supply forces in Afghanistan, they're concerned about the nuclear program, and so forth. And so as a result, they don't speak out about a whole bunch of things, right? Whereas the US is happy to speak about it in other countries where they don't have as countries. So I think that always gets to an issue, which is how to balance value politics versus ideal politics versus real politics. When it comes to Myanmar and the Rohingya, especially, it is a delicate situation, and it is a complicated one in the sense that it's like a lot of issues. This is not always as clean cut. That being said, obviously we have an influx of Rohingya into India sometimes, and also this threatens the future of Bangladesh-Myanmar relations. When India actually wants a more cooperative relationship in Bangladesh and Myanmar for its own connectivity. So I think India's attitude for some of the regional, in its immediate periphery, has often been to not publicly criticize, but to privately push for certain solutions. I don't know specifically about Myanmar in the last year, but I know in a few other countries in India's neighborhood, India has pushed very strongly in private for various democracy and human rights objectives, but has decided not to publicly call them out. And again, India can take much more idealistic stances when it doesn't have when there's less proximity. On the issue of sovereignty, I would say absolutely India did have double standards for much of its history. As I mentioned, India actually was intervening in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh in the 70s and 80s. So it's not a new phenomenon per se. And the reason why India spoke up about sovereignty was it was worried about its own nation-building project, or state-building project, right? Which is it was worried that other countries would intervene in Indian affairs. So there was an element of double standards and hypocrisy to that. I would contest, though, the notion that what happened in Nepal over the last 2 years has been a violation of Nepali sovereignty, which is you had a situation where Nepal was passing a constitution. The manner in which that constitution was passed was very politicized, but it was also not an inclusive process. That's a Nepali matter. But it did discriminate significantly against actually a majority of the population, but it's more specifically against a group of the Deshis who have who have relatives on the Indian side of the border. And again, because India and Nepal do have an open border, you have issues on both sides of the border. As a result, it did become a domestic issue for India as well. And India was faced with the challenge of, now that this constitution had passed, and it was passed very suddenly, despite assurances that to the contrary from Nepali leaders, India was faced with the issue of what to do about it. Now, there are various things that a country can do and there was a real concern that there were Madheshi protests in which people were killed in Nepal. There was a concern that this would become more militarized. And that, if you look at the experience of Sri Lanka, in the 1970s you had a discriminatory constitution passed. What was a peaceful minority. You had militarization in the 1980s, and this finally required necessity Indian intervention later in the 80s. So, from India's point of view, they were trying to prevent a bad situation from getting worse. And that led to what does India do about this? I think we had a very uncomfortable situation for a little while where India, at the very least, officially did not do a blockade, but tacitly supported at least a blockade on Nepal. Did it meet its objectives? Probably not entirely. In fact, one could make the case that India's steps were not strong enough, because many of those issues still linger on as unresolved issues for the Nepali constitution. But there was, in some ways, a compromise reached in December of 2015 that basically there was an agreement to amend certain elements of it, but it's still an unresolved issue. What we've seen since then is also a realization on the part of some of the political leaders in Nepal that they need to work with India. And the fact that the new Nepali Prime Minister came to India on his first visit just yesterday, day before, I think is indicative of that. Again, we tend to underestimate the degree to which the two countries, we have roughly 5 to 7 million Nepalis in India at any given time. Nepal is very heavily dependent on India for energy. You have Nepali officers, Nepali soldiers in the Indian army. So I mean, it's a very unusual agreement that they have. And oftentimes when there has been a dispute, Nepali political leaders have actually asked India to intervene. In this case, the Malaysian leaders did. So it is a much more complex issue, but I wouldn't necessarily say that this was an infringement upon Nepali sovereignty.
So just to follow up, if I may. So do you believe that India's steps opened Nepal up to much more Chinese influence? And on the first idea, so I understand your point about like regional neighbors, etc. But do you think when India, say, refuses to vote in the UNHRC on votes pertaining to Israel and Palestine, etc., after that, do you think it's fair for India to take like the moral high ground on human rights issues when it does not necessarily oppose it when it's like convenient to?
Right. Okay. So, I think the Chinese influence in Nepal is very exaggerated. Most trade that Nepal does is either with India or through India. 85 to 90% of it. There has been an increase in Chinese investment, and there's been an increased involvement of Chinese political participation in Nepal. So that's there for sure. Some of this predates what's happened in the last few years. But I also, again, given the nature of India-Nepal relations, China is not going to displace India as Nepal's most important international partner. China would not offer an open border with Nepal. China would not be offering the kinds of economic assistance that India has offered, including earthquake relief efforts. China will not be allowing Nepali soldiers to fight in the Chinese army. So it's a fundamentally very different relationship. All of India's neighbors have, there are elements of the political leaderships of all of India's neighbors that have used China to try and negotiate better terms with India. And that's continuing, and that's actually increased in anything. But I would not I would be wary of overstating the level of Chinese influence in Nepal and this narrative that India sort of pushed Nepal into China. I mean, that Nepal has often played up the China card to try and extract better terms from India. On the UNHCR, look, I would look at it a different way. I think it's in some ways it may seem like there's a contradiction between, again, realpolitik and idealpolitik. In fact, some of it is really about short term versus long term. In the short term, sometimes India needs things, and that requires making less than idealistic choices. In the long run, I think there is an understanding that an open, democratic, stable, pluralistic world is a better one. And so I think if you look at the long game that India is playing on, it's been pushing in that direction. So does India sometimes sacrifice that long-term vision for certain short-term contingencies? Absolutely, it does that. Every country does that. But I think the long game, if you look at the long-term trends, think about this just in the neighborhood. Arguably, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, Maldives, Nepal, Sri Lanka, even Afghanistan, you could say, are arguably more democratic than they've ever been. Myanmar. slightly more complicated for a number of reasons that you may know better. Can you make it so quick? One question so that we get 2 hands here, and then you as well. So only the guys have spoken. So maybe any of you have a question? No. Anybody back there? Okay. Okay. All right. Go ahead.
So my name is Parth. I'm in the first year and I'm from Mumbai. I have a question regarding last year's International Tribunal's ruling that China's invasion or China's territorial aggressions in the South China Sea are baseless.
Yeah.
And so China blatantly disregarded the ruling and they openly criticized it. And this essentially shows that it does not really respect the international court, doesn't really respect its rulings. So in that kind of a scenario, what is the importance of such courts, and like how do we know that these rulings in the future will be binding on China if there are any?
Why don't you take? I'll address that question.
Sir, I'm Parth Khare. I'm from Delhi. So you talked about those figurative boats that India missed in 45 and 91. So do you feel that this whole Middle East situation, when it will be resolved, whenever it is, will be another one of those figurative boats, and should India actively seize that opportunity to shape and become one of those superpowers that we want to be?
Okay, 3 very good questions. So one on China ignoring the Court of Arbitration. So it became slightly more complicated for a couple of reasons. One is you had a change of government in the Philippines. And Philippines had brought the case against China. And the new government in the Philippines decided not to take it up after the arbitration. So it was the previous government that had really been pushing the issue. So that didn't help, right? Which in terms of holding China to account, right? The second slight problem is that the US has not ratified UNCLOS, right? So its own, while it says it abides by the principles of UNCLOS, because it has not ratified it, it's on a weaker footing in terms of trying to implement, to impose.
Non-ratified what?
The UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. So the US is a signatory but has not ratified it. So that somewhat erodes its ability to implement, to be the implementer. I mean, this is a broad challenge in international law, which is the implementation is really up to nation states. No? So you can have any ruling, somebody has to then implement it. However, I wouldn't say China has gotten away scot-free. And in fact, I think you can see what's happening with Bhutan to some degree having been influenced by China's approach to that, which is what seems to be the case in Doklam is China has actually violated written agreements that China has entered into bilaterally, one with Bhutan, one with India. So there is a deep level of distrust that if there is some kind of agreement to diffuse the situation, that China will abide by its terms. So I think that others have realized that too. Now, had China, reacted differently to the South China Sea, oh, okay, we're sorry, we'll move our facilities out of the South China Sea and recognize that this is international waters. I think there would have be a certain greater degree of trust in bilateral dealings with China. But I think one of the problems is with any international law, it still is up to nation states to impose costs on countries for violating that. And this actually gets to the last question, although I'll address that more carefully. That's what really a sign of international leadership, right? Which is who are the countries that actually try and implement international rules? If India becomes an implementer, that's really a sign that India has arrived. You could say that India has done that before, right? So, Bangladesh, where the UN, for various political reasons, did not recognize that there was need for humanitarian intervention in East Pakistan, but India did, right? So India was in fact upholding international law, even when the UN and the United States and others were not. So again, it was also opportunity. I'm not saying this was just, it was only an idealistic objective on India's part. It was a case where ideals and realpolitik aligned, and so that made it an easy decision to intervene. But it also happened to be a case where. So yeah, I hope that. On Trump, how do you deal with Trump? India has actually dealt with Trump much better than most other countries. You had what was a very normal meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump. It was, the only thing that got a little bit of attention was the fact that they hugged. I mean, that was there was no controversy. Which, given that every other engagement that Trump has had with a foreign leader there's been some misstep, something said, some midnight tweet that has reversed exactly what they agreed to. We didn't have that with India. How did we get? It wasn't all accident. I mean, it was not just because there was a lot of careful planning that went into it. One element was that don't bring up the issues that you know are going to be sensitive issues for him. So people say, why wasn't H-1B visas brought up? Apart from the fact that H-1B visas are actually the domain of the U.S. Congress and not the presidency. Had anybody raised that with Trump, he would have focused on that and made that a big issue. Same thing with trade. So there was a small acknowledgement of trade, but they decided not to make that an issue. And only then deal with issues that there was a commonality of interests. If you want further evidence of why not to do this, the transcript of Trump's phone conversation with the Australian Prime Minister was leaked. And it all ended up being about 1,000-odd refugees that Australia had agreed previously that the US would take. And Trump went ballistic over this small issue to the detriment of the larger relationship with Australia. So I think that is really the way to deal with it, which is with him focus on issues that you're going to get a good positive vibe from. And then work with the people around him on the more more sensitive details. I think that was done on Afghanistan, for example. So the U.S. National Security Advisor came to Delhi to discuss Afghanistan a few months ago, and many of his staff have since come. So when President Trump made this speech just this week about Afghanistan policy, where he mentioned India, it was not entirely a surprise to people here, because India had been consulted on that. Was it exactly how India would have phrased it? Probably not, because there was, for example, a mention of trade, but that is Trump's little personal touch there. But overall, I mean, I think the larger tone of that statement, I think India was in agreement with. Does that help?
Yes, it does.
Okay. And on yours, so if you just rephrase the question again, just.
So you talked about those figurative goals which India faced in 1945 and 1991.
Yeah, the order. Okay. So those were on a global basis, right? So you had World War II. In the run up to World War II, there were several major powers in the world who were all competing with each other for relative influence. The US and Japan were butting heads in the Pacific. You still had major global British-French empires. You had Russia and Germany, again, starting to butt heads in Central Europe. And so you had, these major powers. By the end of World War II, effectively you had two victors, four of those were losers. Even though Britain and France were on the winning side, they were completely devastated and bankrupt from World War II, and were unable to remain global colonial powers. China was decimated, of course, as well by its own internal civil war preceded it. Japan and Germany were defeated, and so that really just left the US and Soviet Union. And so we ended up with a bipolar world, which both sides realized, even as the war was ending, that this was what the world was going to look like. There's a good case that can be made that the US dropping the atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was less to defeat Japan. They could have done that anyway. But it was to bring a quick end to the war and send a signal to Moscow. And so in some ways they were the first shots of the Cold War. So that really meant a complete reordering of the global system, not just in the Middle East, not just in South Asia, And again, the process of decolonization was part of that. India was a beneficiary of that. What we had in 1991, again, to many people's shock, was the sudden collapse of the Soviet Union. And again, I think it came as much of a shock to the US as anybody else. And so you had the state where the US was still the sole superpower. You had other powerful countries around the world, but nobody else was competing at the realm of ideas and on a global military basis. In the US and Soviet, you had US, during the Cold War, you had US and Soviet proxies fighting in Latin America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia. So it really was global at that scale. So that's what I mean when I talk about systemic shocks to the international system. What we're seeing in West Asia and the Middle East now is a great deal of upheaval. Started with the Arab Spring, it sparked civil wars in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon was always Egypt. And it has led to a recalibration of sorts. You can say the only success story really has been Tunisia, which is demonetized. But in many ways, the Arab Spring either led to a reversion of authoritarianism or civil wars. In some ways, this is against the backdrop of Iran, a competition between Iran and Saudi Arabia, largely. Again, India has equities with all of these countries. India has important and necessary relationships with Iran, it has with Saudi Arabia, it has with Israel. And it's very tricky to maintain a balance. And most countries have not successfully done so. They're very clearly drawn. I think there was a realization that in this, India was undervaluing its interests with the Gulf Arab states. That is, this is where the Indian diaspora was. These were the suppliers of Indian energy. And actually, it was the Arab Spring context that made them also rethink India. So, from their point of view, suddenly they were thinking about how do we plan for a post-oil economy. Maybe the support for radical groups is not such a good thing, it's gone too far. And so suddenly India became a bit more important. And they were looking at the Indian economic growth, India as a relatively stable power. India became more important. So just in the last 6 months, we've had the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi come. We've had summits with Saudi Arabia. We had a major delegation from Bahrain that was interested just in economic investment in India recently. So they're now rethinking India as well. And so it's up to India to seize that opportunity. So I think we have seen, if you look at the change over the last 3-4 years, the sharpest change has really been in India's relations with the Gulf Arab states. And then we've taken the Israel relationship to a higher level as well. If there's been a loss, it's been to some degree in the relationship with Iran. It's not only because of India's choices. It's also been because Iran's choices have changed. And in part there's an indication that Iran's attitude towards Afghanistan has changed a little bit. While India and Iran did cooperate a lot more in the 1990s in Afghanistan, that they have a different set of priorities. So I think that this is the changing landscape. It's still important for India to balance these relationships. We don't know how this will turn out. But I don't think we'll end up with, whatever it is, we won't end up with a situation where there'll be a single major power in the Middle East. Russia is now re-involved in Syria. China has important economic relations. The US is there, but is, I think, becoming a little less involved in things. I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing greater Indian military cooperation with particularly the GCC countries and Israel. But I don't think this will be a place where you will see a complete reordering of the international system. Like 1945 or 1995. I think what will be a key indicator of that would be if China is able to get its way with respect to some of its neighbors, including Japan, but not limited to Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Southeast Asia, and so forth. If China is able to establish hegemony in Asia, we are in for a very different world. I hope I addressed your question. I think we went very long over time. I hope that's not a problem. But
thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.